The 90s was a great decade for automotive fans. Some of the greatest sports cars of every kind took hold of the world in the 90s, motocross was at its absolute peak, and Japanese and Italian sport bikes leaped decades ahead in terms of performance and technology. For many, the peak of sport bike progress came at the end of the decade in 1999 in the form of the Suzuki Hayabusa. The best way to understand the Hayabusa in its context and Suzuki's intent with this insane motorcycle is to understand the name. Unlike many motorcycle manufacturers, Suzuki has often been more intentional with their flagship model names. Hayabusa. Hayabusa is the Japanese name given to the peregrine falcon, the fastest moving animal on the planet, capable of reaching upwards of 200 miles per hour. But it's so much deeper than just speed. See, the peregrine falcon isn't just known for its speed, it's also known as a predator with its own favorite prey, an animal it thoroughly enjoys chasing down and eating, namely blackbirds. See, just a few years before Suzuki's ridiculous Hayabusa was unveiled, Honda had released the Blackbird, a motorcycle meant to go faster than any motorcycle had ever gone, and Suzuki's Hayabusa was meant to run it down and eat it. Now, this was an interesting time in the world of sport bike development. Raw power and performance coupled with the best suspension and chassis development meant that full-blown race bikes in 750cc and 1000cc forms were now readily available to the average rider. The biggest impact from the 80s, thanks to bikes like the Kawasaki GP-Z900R and of course the Suzuki GSX-R 750 and the RC30, is that now the fastest and most powerful motorcycles in the world also actually had the handling to match, unlike the big superbikes of the 70s. But a sort of split was happening in the sport bike world in the 90s. A good example of this is the Kawasaki Ninja ZZ R1100 or ZX11, depending on where you lived. That motorcycle took a very different route from the production sort of Grand Prix formula of other sport bikes. It was a bike more focused on outright top speed, which was over 170 miles per hour, by the way. And it's that bike that the Honda Blackbird was really taking aim at and ultimately defeated in the race to build the most powerful and fastest motorcycle. The Blackbird was faster than the ZX11 by like 1 mile per hour. These motorcycles started the top speed war and the horsepower war between Japanese manufacturers, and one bike ended that war. See, Hayabusas, or peregrine falcons, don't just move a tiny bit faster than blackbirds. No, they hunt them down and devour them. Suzuki wasn't setting out to make a motorcycle that went, just a few miles per hour faster or made a little bit more horsepower so that they could get the press of having, the fastest, most powerful motorcycle. No, they set out to make an entirely new kind of motorcycle altogether. Yoshira-san, who was the head of design for the Hayabusa, stated this. He said that the concept of the first Hayabusa was to create an original and dominating impact with superior aerodynamics, as well as being the most powerful sports motorcycle. I designed it with the intention of getting attention. Using a unique motorcycle design, it needed to be the ultimate road-legal motorcycle with the highest performance from mass-produced bikes. Hayabusa was more than just a random name applied to a machine because it sounded cool. In fact, it doesn't sound that cool. Not as cool as Fireblade, at least. The peregrine falcon, or the Hayabusa, is able to reach speeds of over 200 miles per hour primarily because of aerodynamics. Suzuki's method for better sport bike performance through aerodynamics and specifically wind tunnel development goes back to really the Suzuki Katana. See, that bike had been dethroned as the fastest production motorcycle, but not because of aerodynamics necessarily. Rather, it was just that other motorcycles were more powerful. So Suzuki decided to pair the two concepts, significantly more power, but now with groundbreaking aerodynamics. Now, the overall shape of the Hayabusa is the product of extensive wind tunnel testing with a rider on board, and the goal was really extended high-speed riding. Yes, 0 to 60 and 0 to 100 was important. I mean, the Hayabusa would take the record for the fastest production 0 to 60 of any vehicle this year. And also, it's worth noting that the bike did not just have top-end power. It also made incredible torque. But the main goal was to make a bike that could power you to near 200 miles per hour as efficiently and, oddly enough, as safely as possible. One writer points out that the Hayabusa is so fast, it makes slight bends on the highway feel like corners. and he's not wrong. And the Hayabusa doesn't have wings on it. Don't tell me a Superleggera isn't just going to fly away at 200 miles per hour. It's definitely going to fly away. I'm kidding. I know that winglets are meant to keep the bike grounded, not fly away. Just chill. The bodywork of the Hayabusa was, and still is, really unlike anything else. Inspired in theory by the Peregrine Falcon, but in practice, its shape is closer to that of, say, a high-speed locomotive. I mean, imagine if a Peregrine Falcon was shaped like a Hayabusa. That would make it even more terrifying. It's helpful to understand the way that trains are designed, specifically trains that are meant to safely carry passengers at incredibly high speeds and with stability. These trains often have a specific elongated head design, and actually with Japanese trains specifically, designing the front of the train for aerodynamics to the extent that much of the front of the train actually can't even be used for passengers because of the way it's shaped. The design of high-speed trains, not much unlike the Hayabusa, brings a focus on really smooth surfaces to reduce drag and to reduce pressure. Motorcycle designers face many different problems than train or even car designers when it comes to aerodynamics. At 200 miles per hour, there are so many more factors than just the force of the atmosphere as the machine powers through it head on. There's things like crosswinds and heat movement and the buildup of pressure on specific parts of the bike and the rider and, incredible aerodynamic drag and a crazy mixture of air and sound waves and forces after the air goes around the motorcycle and around the rider and mixes with the exhaust and mixes with the pressure coming up from the rear tire. It's not the same as like a single hunk of material like a car. The fact that you, as a rider, are part of the aerodynamic equation, this is why MotoGP riders are usually, they're kind of tiny, because they can sort of hide down in the bike easily and eliminate as much drag as possible. Many of these factors are commonplace in current sport bike design because the ability to reach 150 or 180 miles per hour is just all too common. And the fact that we have 200 horsepower motorcycles that have absolutely zero aerodynamics and that do not cover the rider at all is just so ludicrous when you really think about it. Now, with the Hayabusa, the main innovation has to do with the bulbous shape of the bodywork. This was cutting-edge aerodynamic design, unlike anything that had ever existed on a motorcycle. I mean, when you look at motorcycles from the 90s, and specifically the motorcycles that the Hayabusa was trying to compete with in this hypersport segment, they're not at all like the Hayabusa. It's completely different looking. Now, much of the discovery for two-wheeled aerodynamics made by Suzuki's team are still present today. Even the position of the rider with the seat and tank enabling the rider to really tuck down further and pull their legs back, making the rider essentially become kind of one unit with the bike, allowing the rider and the motorcycle to cut through the air at 200 miles per hour. As much as the engine is important, it's the aerodynamic shape that's really the standout feature of the Hayabusa, and it's what enabled it to go beyond the hypersport market and really make its own segment, which is what Suzuki called ultimate sport. But the overall shape of the Hayabusa did more than just make the bike faster and more usable at ridiculously high speeds. Its unique form made it stand out in a way that few motorcycles have ever stood out in their own market. When you see a Hayabusa, you know it's a Hayabusa, and that look has become synonymous with the bike's status as having sort of otherworldly performance. The designers knew that the Hayabusa would be seen as rather ugly, and in some ways, that was intentional. For all of you guys who get mad when people say that the Hayabusa is kinda ugly, claiming that it's just the absolute epitome of two-wheeled beauty. Well, 10 years after the release of the Hayabusa, the main designer responsible for its look, named Koji Yoshiura, told MCN that the aim of the overall look was to create a somewhat grotesque design. Those are his words. And that he wanted it to create a strong initial impact. You're supposed to look at the Hayabusa and kind of squint and go, what in the world? But it would be the performance and nature of the bike itself as a motorcycle that would carry this unique design into the future and make it iconic. The design would be nothing, probably a failure, honestly, if it wasn't paired with what the motorcycle itself was. While 200 miles per hour achieved with stability would have been a feat in and of itself, the Hayabusa also needed to be an all-around motorcycle if it was going to be a massive success and really carry Suzuki into the future. But getting the kind of power necessary to hit these kinds of speeds meant that they needed to have a big old lunk of a motor, 1300 cc's to be exact. So there just wasn't a way at this point to make this bike as light as, say, a standard leader bike. In fact, specifically balanced weight was part of the equation for hitting and maintaining high speeds. So Suzuki was tasked with making this 550-pound rocket ship feel rather light and nimble and easily maneuverable, both at low speeds and in the corners. In many ways, Suzuki had a blueprint for making a sport bike that handled well, and that was the GSXR 750. So much of the DNA of the Hayabusa comes straight from that iconic motorcycle, from the double overhead cam, liquid-cooled 16-valve, transverse inline-4 engine used as a stress member, to actually having an even more rigid chassis and swing arm than the 750, perfectly balanced suspension designed for the Hayabusa's varied uses, firm enough for virtually any sport riding that the average person could throw at it, but soft enough to remain comfortable for the long-distance miles that its riders would use it for. Now, technically speaking, the Hayabusa's engine really wasn't anything spectacular. It was just larger than any sport bike prior to it. The real genius wasn't getting a 1300cc inline 4 to make 175 horsepower. It was getting that big of an engine to actually be usable in a sport bike. It did rep a few new features meant to dampen the effect of that power on the chassis and rider, things like a gear-driven counterbalancer. But for the most part, Suzuki really wasn't reinventing the wheel with the engine. The simplicity of this engine, though, is what would ultimately make the Hayabusa a legend. Not only would it prove to be incredibly reliable and able to withstand its own power, it also really lent itself well to customization. For every rider who buys a Hayabusa and leaves it completely stock, there's another rider who buys one and completely customizes it. From stretching the wheelbase for even better high-speed stability, or just because they think it looks cool, let's be real, to throwing a turbo on it because, 200 horsepower isn't enough, we need 400 horsepower. I know these things seem ridiculous to most riders, but like every great, highly customizable motorcycle through history, most of it's just for fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. Creating a record-breaking performance motorcycle like the Hayabusa doesn't come without consequences. See, the Hayabusa put all of the manufacturers who were vested in this hypersport segment, and really the race to build more powerful motorcycles, it put those manufacturers on their back foot. Spoiler alert, those were all Japanese companies. And the result of this pressure was a few other motorcycles. Honda tried and failed to make a faster motorcycle by updating their Blackbird with fuel injection and with Ram Air, but the Peregrine Falcon was still faster than a Blackbird. But it was the upcoming release of the ZX-12R which was rumored to break the previously unthinkable 200 mile per hour barrier. And it was rumors of that motorcycle that really started to raise concerns among politicians. The question was this: do our children really need two-wheeled vehicles capable of 3 times the legal highway speed limit? As much as I generally don't favor this kind of government intervention on private companies, you have to admit, it's a fair question. Maybe instead of asking how a manufacturer can make a motorcycle that can go over 200 miles per hour, maybe it would be better to ask why our 16-year-olds can legally ride leader bikes in the first place. But that's another discussion. So there were talks of banning the very production of these kinds of motorcycles, and the Japanese companies knew that they needed to chill out with this race to make more powerful, faster motorcycles. So they created a gentleman's agreement, a commitment to limit the top speed of their motorcycles to 300 kph or 186 miles per hour. But nobody knew about this gentleman's agreement when it was happening. So the ZX-12R came out. On paper, it looked like it was going to be faster. Everybody topped it out, and guess what? 300 kph. Even years later, when the ZX-14 came out, powering past Gen 1 Hayabusas with ease, posting a blistering 2.5 seconds 0 to 60. I mean, obviously this bike would go beyond 300 kph. Nope, 300 kph. That was the top speed. Now that agreement would be broken by a company that wasn't really ever involved in the agreement, called MV Agusta. MV Agusta, the company, wasn't even really in existence when the Hayabusa was being developed, but by 2007, when the agreement was broken, the world had changed and the pressure was off. Now I said earlier that the intent of the Hayabusa was to, like a peregrine falcon hunting down its prey, take out the slower Honda Blackbird. But that wasn't really the main goal when the Hayabusa project first started. The interesting thing about the Hayabusa is that when Suzuki initially started thinking about and designing the motorcycle, the intent was primarily just to enter this hypersport market with the best motorcycle that they could make. It wasn't really their goal initially to make the most powerful or fastest motorcycle in the world, more just the best motorcycle in this segment. And this is why early prototype planning had the motorcycle with an engine of between 900 and 1100 cc's. Through the development of the bike, it became the fastest and most powerful, but not for power and speed in and of themselves. Rideability, usability, comfort, handling, these were the primary goals for the motorcycle as it fit within this hypersport segment, and this is why the Hayabusa became so much more than just a drag strip bike. There are guys bopping around and commuting on their Gen 1 Hayabusas today with like 150,000 miles on them, because in the end, the bike was just pretty good at everything. That's where the Hayabusa became a surprising thing to riders who forked out enough cash to own one, whether they were old enough to ride in 1999 when it was released, or maybe they had a poster of it on their wall and they were able to get one a few decades later. The surprise for these riders is that you initially bought the Hayabusa because it really was a different level of power and performance. It really was that ultimate sport, as Suzuki liked to call it. But after you owned one and, had a few stupid moments where you thankfully didn't die or get pulled over, the bike turned out to be just a great all-around motorcycle. A motorcycle that you could take down to the coffee shop or to a friend's house, or you could gear up and literally ride it across the country with relative comfort. Take the broad windscreen, for example. Primarily, that was meant to provide less drag as the rider tucked in for high speed, but it also just functioned as a really great windscreen overall for normal riding for a sport bike. Rubberized handlebar mounts and foot pegs that feature vibration damping weights, all the little features of the Hayabusa that were meant to aid in the bike's usability at high speed made it so that it was just incredibly usable everywhere. What makes the Hayabusa so legendary isn't primarily its incredible specs. I think it's more the fact that this kind of blistering performance was now made so accessible and so usable. We often think of the great performance cars and motorcycles through history as the rare ones, the Ferraris and maybe the Ducatis. I mean, technically speaking, a Superleggera might go down as a greater feat of motorcycle innovation than a Hayabusa, but who even rides a Superleggera? Who cares? There's like 500 of them, and they're mostly just sitting in climate-controlled collections, while Hayabusas are out on the street, often in Frankenstein form, providing smiles to their owners. Those are the motorcycles that are really remembered, and that, in my opinion, hold that sort of legendary status. Now, I would love to hear from you Hayabusa owners in the comments below. Tell us your story. We'd all love to hear it. And thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe. Even if you're on a Hayabusa, ride safe.